Keep fresh before me the moments of my high resolve. Howard Thurman, Atlanta, Georgia. Keep fresh before me the moments of my high resolve, lest I forget. And we do forget. And the beauty of forgetfulness is that on the other polar opposite of that is the divine remembering. And so it seems as though our life is one seesaw of remembering and forgetting, remembering and forgetting. And I think the aim is not to prevent forgetfulness, but to just aim more for remembering. And so as we look at these topics of diversity and inclusivity, I don't know if you can fully appreciate the fact that as one of our friends that came and photographed you guys a couple of months ago, he goes, "My God, you're Noah's Ark here." And so maybe that's why we won that award. So that's something to be celebrated. And when we think about diversity and when we think about inclusion, it's more than just color of skin, difference of religion, different culture. It's also an inclusivity of understanding what takes place within the psyche of our humanity. And by that I mean all one needs to do is to travel the world, and you start to realize how small the world actually is. Because what the world demonstrates to us is the inclusivity of the internal psyche in terms of our wants and our needs. And our wants and our needs are very simple, and they are universal. And it is that we want to provide for our families. It's that we want to find some semblance of purpose in what it is that we do. And we want to be seen and we want to be heard. And that's not something that just transpires within the borders of the United States, but that is something that exists within every country that I've ever experienced. Every culture, whether they be deemed a prosperous culture or a poverty-ridden culture, the same internal desires exist. And so today, one of the things that we can broach in terms of fully understanding a deeper level of inclusion is understanding that what is transpiring within the psyche, and I use that term in order to describe the inward activity within the subconscious realm of humanity, is a similar underlying current of judgment that we have with regards to what we call wounding. And today's title is called God Comes Through the Wound. And wounding in and of itself has been given a bad rap. So think for a moment, in slow motion, you are falling off of your bicycle. The bicycle that you first learned to ride in, and you know the inevitability of what's about to happen. And as you hit the pavement, in embracing that, it scrapes the skin, and there is a wounding that takes place within the external surface of our bodies. And in the moment that wounding is happening, something else is happening as well. What's rushing in is all the inherent wisdom, the antibodies, in order to produce the healing of that wound. Instantaneously. The moment that you hit, those things go into action. And we understand that because we've seen and experienced that kind of wounding. We cut ourselves, we have some kind of abrasion, and through the miracle of regeneration, things that we don't even control, this wound begins to produce activity, and it's activity for our benefit. And this morning I would like you to consider that the same kind of activity rushes in the moment that there is a psychic wounding. And by psychic wounding, I'm talking about a disruption in our understanding of who and what we are. A disruption in the knowingness of our divinity. How many of you have had disruptions in the knowingness of your divinity, right? What I love about this community is that it's a hodgepodge, it's a melting pot of people who have religious wounding. You all have religious wounding. You know, some people can't stand the word God. And so when I use the word God, they're like, ugh, because that wound is getting triggered, and the pus is just flowing out of it. Warning, I'm going to be graphic today. Some of your wounding is when I said, let's talk about the Bible. And so that religious wounding comes up. And so what's fascinating about psychic wounding is that whatever has happened to us relationally with the world, with other people, if it's not addressed, or I should say, if it's prohibited from doing what naturally needs to occur, just like what happens when we scrape ourselves, if we prohibit the rushing in of the healing for that wound, then what happens to that wound? It gets pushed down into the corridors of our soul, of our thought process, of our consciousness, and there it stagnates, and there it festers. And that wounding and the collection of those wounds then begin to precipitate how we relate present day. Even if it's a wound that occurred decades ago, you and I could think that we're cool and we're fine and we've gotten past all of that. But if we haven't really allowed ourselves to be in conversation with those internal conflicts or those woundings or those stories, and by conversation, I'm not meaning dragging them out and browbeating ourselves and saying, woe is me for the rest of our lives. I'm saying having an intelligent, an emotionally intelligent conversation with those pockets of experience that sit universally in all of us. And so when we don't do that, it doesn't matter how many prosperity courses you take. If a part of your wounding is failure, business failure, or any kind of failure where somebody said you're stupid, or you don't know how, or you termed yourself stupid, or you took some kind of failure personally and then set this unconscious decision that you will never subject yourself to that kind of humiliation ever again, that wounding then remains inside and influences and determines the relationship that you have present day to the infinite abundance that's all around you. It influences that. In other words, it disrupts your connection to the inevitable flow of all that's good. And that's just one prime example. If a part of your wounding is abandonment or betrayal, and who of us among here has not been abandoned or betrayed? Can't we talk? So imagine that occurs, and then subconsciously you decide you will never subject yourself to that ever again. And so it doesn't matter who shows up across the radar. It doesn't matter how many cosmic opportunities present themselves and cross over the threshold invitationally to you and I to experience love, to open our hearts. We can't be available for that because the wound is in control. And so when the great psychologist Carl Jung says God comes through the wound, or when the poet Rumi says the wound is where the light enters, such profound wisdom is telling us not to avoid being wounded, not to play life safely and say, I will never subject myself to that, but to celebrate those wounds because they are essential stepping stones in getting us to what we're evolving and what we're supposed to, from a soul contract, move into. I'm not just going to jump from 0 to 100. No, I'm going to have a little wounding along the way so that when I get to that mile marker, I'm going to have some wisdom underneath my belt. I'm going to have a sense of self. I'm going to have a new understanding and a new relationship of what does and does not necessarily serve me. But I'm not going to know, you're not going to know any of those things unless we have gathered gathered our woundings and put ourselves into situations that require us to be bigger, to be more than what we have allowed ourselves to be. I forgot it was Abraham Lincoln's birthday. Happy birthday, Abe. And I wrote this because this is my favorite Abraham Lincoln quote. It is not, can any of us imagine better? Can we do better? The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. Can I get an amen? The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall, or in other words, set ourselves free, and then we shall save our country. We shall set ourselves free. We must disenthrall ourselves from the wound being in charge. I didn't say disenthrall ourselves or set ourselves free from being wounded, but from letting the wound be in charge. Do you see the difference? Because I don't know about you, but if I want to learn at the feet of someone, I want to go and sit with someone who's been around the block. I want to listen intently to someone whose story has a moment of high resolve that is beckoning me to be able to match that, to give me and set forth for me an example. And so these things that are considered woundings or imperfections are actually beautiful things. One of the books for this month that is in our bookstore is called, what is it, Penelope? The Spirituality of Imperfection. So in other words, it's embracing this idea of imperfection through this wounding and understanding there's rich, fertile soil. There's a spirituality in the humanity, in the flawed journey. And that it isn't about trying to bypass those things, but it's knowing that all along the way as I move, I learn more and more and more about myself. And it takes a certain level of spiritual bravado to say, okay, I'm going to walk into the mystery. I'm going to take my bloody-knuckled fist of control off of this situation, and I'm going to understand and apply the idea that there is an infinite intelligence that knows greater than I do, and I'm not going to micromanage that intelligence anymore. And I'm going to allow myself to stumble and fumble my way through forward, realizing that as I do that, the universe consistently has my back. I'm not throwing myself into some abyss and being abandoned. I'm throwing myself into the mystery of illumination that is asking me to do that. It's that great analogy of the trapeze artist that if they don't let go of the one thing, they'll never be able to grab onto the journey that wants to carry them to the other side. Can you imagine being hired as a trapeze artist and I'm not letting go? And you just swing back to the same platform. I'm not letting go. And I swing back. How boring is that? Let go of the trapeze. Let go and let yourself free fall into catching what is next. But you see, we can't catch what's next if we allow the wounding to say it's not safe to do that. So God, wisdom, illumination comes through the wound to say, all right, take that now. Take that now and become a teacher. Become a way shower for the rest of humanity that's not willing to let go of the trapeze. Prove the principle. Do that. And there are great things that push people, push humanity over the edge. You know, I was flying back on China Southern Airlines. They have the worst movies on China Southern Airlines. Oh my God. Anyway, There was one movie, and it actually is a Academy Award nominated movie this year, and it's called Hell or High Water, and it has Chris Pine in it, the guy that plays the new Captain Kirk in the Star Trek movies, and Jeff Bridges. And it's set in West Texas, the most depressing area of our country that you can imagine. And the cinematography is perfect, the soundtrack's perfect because it's just this gritty, ugly, unscenic thing. And it shows the depressive nature of that particular culture. It's sort of like the Rust Belt, these people that are born into poverty, and they are just one continuous generation of poverty because the wounding of poverty has never been addressed, nor is there a skill within them to know how to address that. So think about that. Some of the wounds that you and I are carrying are multi-generational wounds that we've just accepted. And so here is this collective of people that live in this, there's just no escape. And so Chris Pine has a brother who's a ex-con, and they decide to rob banks. And not to take all this money, but very systematically take small amounts of money because Chris Pine wants to pay his ex-wife so that she can have the farm so that his 2 sons can have a better life. And Jeff Bridges is the sheriff that can't quite figure out who's doing what, but he catches them at the end, but he has no proof. But Chris Pine, admits to him, but now he's retired, so he can't do anything. And Chris Pine says, I've been poor my whole life. I've known nothing but poverty. My parents knew nothing but poverty. My grandparents knew nothing but poverty. It stops with me. So the lesson is rob some banks. Could you rewind that film and edit that piece out, please? But he said he was determined to end that cycle for his boys. And I sat there and I was overcome with just that one little snippet of dialogue. He said, it stops with me. And I wonder if we have the grit and the determination to create action to say that this inherited wounding stops with me. And what that simply means is we have invited God to come through the wound. We have allowed ourselves to transcend what the world says we must do, what a government says we must do, what a collective of people says we must do. We've allowed ourselves to transcend the noise of all of that and to do something proactively so that generationally we are not perpetuating this mythic lifestyle that doesn't serve or expand. And that's one of the reasons why I think a moment of high resolve, and to remember that, is a requirement. It's a requirement for any of us who call ourselves spiritual, for any of us who profess to be moving towards some level of enlightenment, that it's a requirement that you and I begin to create this relationship with our wounding and bring it out from the anguish of the dark corner into the light. How do we do that? We start to talk about it. A few months ago, I think I mentioned that maybe the Catholics were right. Confession is good for the soul. Maybe that 4th and 5th step within recovery programs about creating a moral inventory and sharing that with someone is invaluable. Because the moment that it gets communicated, the moment that the wounding comes out, it's as if a vacuum is created so something new can come in. But when we harbor that, because what will happen if somebody finds out? Or the poison of comparison, where our society shows us that this is what is success and this is what is acceptable, and we buy into that. And let me tell you, you and I will never measure up to that. I will never be able to Photoshop myself in real time. I will never be able to be all the things that advertising is telling me that I should be. And so, without even understanding what's going on, we're subconsciously pushing the wound back into the corner because we're not measuring up to what the world is telling us success or beauty or smarts looks like. I'll just tell you, we're never going to measure up to that. And that's the cycle. So I traveled to Phnom Penh by bus from Siem Reap. Phnom Penh is the capital of Cambodia. And it's a 6.5-hour bus ride with the locals. I was the only gringo on that bus. And I thought, 6.5 hours, all right, go to the bathroom and then buckle down. And I thought, well, that's going to be a long way. And the bus pulled over to the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. And everybody got off. And I thought, this isn't Phnom Penh. This isn't the capital. And everybody's going behind a respective bush or tree to pee. And I went, oh. And so I get off and I go pee with everybody and I come back on. And I finally get to Phnom Penh. But it was there that I met this guy named Matthew, who's from Seattle. And Matthew went to the CSL in Seattle, and he had contacted me several years ago, and he said, I've gone to Cambodia a couple of times, and I have this crazy idea, and I wanted to run it by you because I know that you go to Cambodia. And he said he owned a very successful business in Seattle in partnership, and it was a high-end salon, and they taught nuts and bolts of everything to run the business as well as the actual implementation of cosmetology. And he says, I want to bring this to Phnom Penh, to Cambodia, because I was very affected by the high-risk youth population there. And by high risk, I'm talking about the fact that it's very rare that a boy or a girl gets past a particular age before they're not pulled into the slave trade or any kind of begging or any kind of marginalization of their life. It's just common. And so this kind of risk behavior becomes normal for them. And he goes, I want to be able to take them and to teach them nuts and bolts, how to run a business, how to do cosmetology, so that they can up-level their experience if they pass through this curriculum. I said, sounds great. So it just so happened on this trip, he was graduating his first students that had gone through this whole program. So that's why I went to Phnom Penh. And the thing that struck me the most was a requirement from him in this program was that they had to be willing to talk about what's gone wrong, or the horrors, or in other words, the wounding of their particular experience. And he goes, customarily, they're just not subject to that. And he knew, he said, if I taught them all of these skills, but I didn't address the internal issues that were buried within the dark recesses of their psyche, how long will those skills sustain them before those wounds come up and sabotage everything that they've learned? And I went, oh my God, that's just brilliant. I think I even put a curse word in there. I was brilliant. And he said, David, you know what blew my mind? Is he goes, none of them have had a conversation with any family member about the Civil War. The Civil War in Cambodia, which happened in the 1970s, where 2 million Cambodians were killed. Where Pol Pot started a dictatorial regime and killed anyone that had any advanced education, owned a business, was an artist, was a teacher, wore glasses. They were subjected and marched into rice fields where they were worked to death in the killing fields. And he goes, none of them have had a conversation with anybody surviving that in their families. They just don't talk about it. And he said, so I made them go home and talk about it. And he goes, to witness, to bear witness to them coming back and revealing the stories and the new profound compassion that they had for their parents or their grandparents because they never knew, because no one talks about it. He goes, that cemented everything that I was trying to do for them, because they realized and had a deeper appreciation for the family dynamic that they had taken for granted or had disrespected. And I was just so humbled by that. I took a plane back from Phnom Penh instead of the bus to Siem Reap. And something remarkable happened while I was there. I had been courting different organizations to help support my schools because I had run into sort of a roadblock where the retention of teachers and the quality of teachers was not what I was hoping for. And I thought if there was a university, if there was a company, if there was somebody that I could align with that could help me, well, I aligned with the largest university of Cambodia, which Cambodia is small, so to say the largest university of Cambodia by comparison, but it's 35,000 students studying progressive English in Panasastra University of Cambodia. And I had multiple meetings, and in one of those meetings, the chancellor came to the meeting. The head of the man who actually founded the university. And through a series of events, he agreed to help sponsor my schools. And so I spent some time with him, and I rode around Siem Reap in his 1948 military Jeep over the potholes and the dust. And in this month's book, there's something in there called attending. And when you hear the word attending, what do you think of? Showing up. And so this form of attending is about being able to listen when another one is sharing or expressing their wound. And in the book, it says to appreciate the inner meaning of another's experience requires something not often considered: the ability to listen truly and well. All community begins in listening. Spirituality, wisdom, that which all seek, is initially transmitted from one person to another by attending, which means to be present in a hearing way, to listen to others in such a way that they are willing to surrender, and you are willing to surrender your worldview. It is very rare when somebody is willing to surrender their worldview. That means that they're willing to say, everything that I have subscribed to up to now, I'm willing to consider that that's not the end-all be-all. But to be attending to someone is not about thinking what you're going to say, but about being fully present. And when we in a community attend to one another, particularly in the idea of this wounding, the vulnerability that it takes for people to be able to tell, and for them to understand that what they're telling is not the finish line of who they are, but it's somewhere in the middle. And as they continue to write the book of their life, that each chapter that follows that wounding is then determined by what you and I do in terms of taking personal responsibility for our lives. And so I'm listening to him in this Jeep, and he told me, he said, you know, I barely escaped the Civil War. He said, I was a young man and I had gone to Phnom Penh because I was eligible for a work-study program in the United States. And I went to see if they would send me. And I left my village. I got all the way to Phnom Penh, found out that I could leave that week. And that week is the week that Pol Pot came in and put the barriers, stripped all of the communication, radio, newspapers, shut everything down. And he got on a plane and had no way to communicate to his family. that he was flying to the United States. And he said for 20 years, and he went all the way and got his doctoral degree at the University of Irvine and other colleges within the Southern California area. And he was telling me this story, and he said, I had no idea whether or not they were alive, and they had no idea whether or not I was alive. What he learned, though, was that most of his family wanted to go ahead and have a ceremony to pronounce him dead, and his mother would not let them do that. Mother kept saying, no, no. And he was asked to deliver a program on what used to be called VOA, Voice of America, and a transistor radio that he used to sneak into the rice fields when he was a young boy. He said, do you know the first American song that I ever heard was on that transistor radio in the rice fields of Cambodia? And it was Karen Carpenter's Yesterday Once More. He goes, it's my favorite song. Thank God it wasn't Leonard Skinner or something. Anyway, Sweet Home Alabama, or I don't know. But he said on that same transistor radio, his cousin was listening to a broadcast on VOA, Voice of America, and Chancellor Chanthan was being interviewed about education, and his cousin stopped, and he goes, that's my cousin's voice. That's my cousin's voice. And he suspected then that he wasn't dead after all, but he didn't dare say anything to the rest of the family. And then an English professor came there that he knew, and he gave this woman an envelope, and he said, I can't tell you who to give it to or when to give it to. Don't show it to anybody, but when you intuitively feel that the timing is right, give this letter to somebody to let them know, my village and my family, that I'm alive. And she was able to give that letter to yet another family member. And he said that he wasn't until he was able to get back into the country around 1995 that he traveled all the way. And he said when his mother saw him, that she just wailed. And so here we are. We're driving in his 1948 Jeep, this chancellor of this university. And he's telling me this story, and I'm attending to his story. And I'm not saying anything. And he goes, and he's speaking in his Cambodian accent, and he goes, and my mother knew that I was alive. And to watch him break, and to watch that level of emotion come out in a culture that isn't predisposed to do that, was one of the most richest experiences, because what it did was it allowed him to take his wound just for a moment, and bring it to the surface so that his voice could crack just a little bit with emotion. And that's what you do, and that's what I do when we have the wherewithal to attend and hold space for another person, so that God can come through their wound, not by you and I trying to manufacture and fix it the way that we think it needs to be fixed, but just by being there. And so that's what we are called to do, is to be there for another. I saw a report yesterday about the refugees and the fact that if they're able to make it into a different country, but they're isolated and pocketed away because they're too different, the wounding, the psychological wounding that they have already gone through will simply perpetuate itself because they're not being integrated with other people. And not to marginalize or diminish the word refugee, but I want you to think of that word for a minute. What does it mean? This amazing sense of displacement. And so in some way, maybe a part of your wounding is attainable to this idea of being some kind of refugee where you don't belong, where you have been kicked out of whatever social circles or family constructs that meant something to you. And I would ask, that you not hold that in any longer. That you let God come through the wound. And just like the chancellor told that woman professor, he said, you'll know when to give this. I say this to you this morning. You will know the right and perfect person to be able to present your wound. You will know. So that you don't perpetuate the wound and go, well, David told me I should do this, and then you just tell it to anybody, and they're not skilled enough, and then you go back into the dark recesses because the wounding tells you it's not safe. You will know when it is safe. And I think that that's the next step of our individual and our collective healing, is to allow us to become more intelligent with regards to the whole model of our emotionality, our physicality, and our spirituality. That, my friend, is inclusion. And that's what we are called to do. And so it is.
Hi, I'm David Ault, and I simply want to say thanks. Thanks for taking the time to watch our broadcast here at Spiritual Living Center of Atlanta. We have a vision, and that vision is to reawaken all to their spiritual magnificence. And one of the ways that we are able to do that is through this very medium of broadcasting. So if you got anything out of this, if you felt in any way inspired, or if something spoke to you directly, then I extend an invitation to you to become a part of our family by donating. And there are many ways in order for you to be able to do that. One is to simply go to our website at slca.com, and there you will find all different kinds of prompts that will help you support what it is that we are doing here in Atlanta. One way is to become a pledger. That means that you decide on a monthly basis that you are going to help us with this vision. Another way is to donate through our management system called Fellowship One, another through PayPal, and another even easier way is on your cell phone. You can do what's called text to tithe, and that number is 404-796-7030. Again, thank you so much for your support, and I invite you to come back weekly to see what it is that we're up to. Blessings.